The bag hit the floor of the bedroom with a dull, heavy thud, and Grace Easton did not look up when she heard it land. Her hands moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that only comes from doing something so many times that the heart has gone numb to it. She folded her blue cotton dress, the one with the small pearl buttons that ran all the way to the collar, and she placed it on top of the stack already resting inside the worn leather travel bag. She pressed it flat with her palm. She did not cry. She had already decided she was done crying. This was the third time she had packed this bag in 4 months. The first time, Jonas Townsend had come to find her sitting on the front porch step with it, and he had sat down beside her without a word. And somehow, without a single promise being made aloud, she had gone back inside and emptied the bag herself, piece by piece, before supper. The second time, she had gotten as far as the main road at the edge of the Townsend property, the bag in her left hand, the hot Arizona dust rising up around her boots, and it had been the land itself that stopped her, she told herself afterward. Just the land. Not the way Jonas had appeared at the top of the ridge on his roan mare, watching her with that expression that seemed to hold every word he had never learned how to say. But this third time was different. This time she had made a decision that was like iron inside her chest. This time she was not stopping. She lifted a second dress, a plain gray one, and began to fold it with sharp, deliberate corners. What she did not know, what she could not have known from where she stood at the foot of the iron-framed bed with her back to the open doorway, was that a small boy was standing just outside in the narrow hallway. He was 8 years old, with dark hair that curled at his ears the same way his father's did, and eyes the color of deep creek water. His name was Eli Townsend, and he was pressing one bare foot on top of the other as he watched her fold that dress, his small face holding the particular kind of pain that children carry when they understand more than adults think they do. He watched her tuck the dress into the bag. He watched her pull the leather strap around and begin to buckle it. Then he moved. Quietly, the way only children and deer can move when they choose to be invisible, he crept into the room. Grace had turned toward the window. She was looking out at the flat, red-stained land of the Arizona Territory, the dust trails rising in the distance where the heat shimmered like water that was never really there, and she was making herself remember all the reasons that had brought her to this decision, all the buried secrets, the hidden motives, the things Jonas Townsend had not told her when she had first arrived in Redemption, Arizona, in the spring of 1884. Behind her, Eli's small fingers moved to the buckle of the leather bag. He unfastened it without a sound. He reached inside, and with the careful solemnity of a child performing something he understood to be sacred, he lifted the gray dress out of the bag and refolded it. He placed it on the bed. Then he reached in again and took out the blue one with the pearl buttons, and he laid that beside the gray, smoothing it with both palms just as he had watched Grace do 100 times before. He worked steadily, quietly, his little heart hammering in his chest, his dark eyes flicking to Grace's back every few seconds until the bag was empty. Then he sat down on the floor beside it, wrapped both arms around his knees, and waited. Grace Easton turned around and found him there. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke. The dry Arizona wind came through the half-open window and moved the curtain, and the late afternoon light was the color of copper, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then Eli looked up at her with those creekwater eyes, and he said, very quietly, "Please don't go, Miss Grace." And something behind Grace Easton's iron resolve cracked open like dried earth after the first rain. She had not come to Arizona Territory looking for love. That much was the clearest truth she could offer about herself, and she had always been a woman who prized truth above almost everything else. She had come from St. Louis, Missouri, in March of 1884, on a train that smelled of coal smoke and other people's lives, carrying the leather bag that was now sitting empty on the floor of Jonas Townsend's bedroom, with a letter of employment folded in the inner pocket of her traveling coat. The letter had been brief and entirely businesslike. It was from a rancher in the Arizona Territory named Jonas Townsend, relayed through a placement agency in St. Louis that matched educated women with frontier households in need of a governess or household manager. The letter stated that Mr. Townsend had a son of 7 years and a working cattle ranch of some 1,200 acres outside the town of Redemption, Arizona, and that he required a capable woman of good character to manage the household and provide the boy with a proper education. The salary offered was $14 a month, which was more than Grace had been earning doing seamstress work in the city, and more than enough to make the uncertainty of frontier life seem manageable. Grace had been 26 years old when she read that letter, and she had been in St. Louis for 2 years following the collapse of everything she had built before that. She had grown up in Memphis, Tennessee, in a household that had considered itself prosperous until it wasn't, and she had spent her early 20s watching the things she had trusted most transform into betrayals she had not seen coming. A man she had planned to marry had revealed a dark past she had never been permitted to glimpse. A family business had collapsed under the weight of debts kept secret from her. She had left Memphis with $70, a leather bag, and the conviction that she would never again place her life in anyone else's hands without first understanding exactly what she was walking into. So she had read the letter from Jonas Townsend 3 times. She had asked the placement agency pointed questions about his character, his history, his standing in the community of Redemption. She had received vague but adequate reassurances, and she had gotten on the train. The journey from St. Louis to the Arizona Territory in March of 1884 took the better part of 4 days on the Southern Pacific Line, and Grace spent most of it watching the landscape change through the window beside her seat. She watched Missouri give way to the flat brown plains of Kansas, and then to the strangeness of New Mexico Territory, and finally to the particular quality of Arizona light, which was unlike anything she had seen before. It hit the red rock formations with such directness, such shameless intensity, that the landscape seemed to be lit from within rather than from above. Redemption, Arizona, was a town of roughly 400 people, sitting on the edge of a broad, shallow valley where cattle ranching had taken root in the decade following the Civil War. The Southern Pacific Line had reached a junction 12 miles from the town itself in 1882, and a twice-weekly stage ran the remainder of the distance into Redemption proper. Grace arrived on the stage on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, and she stepped down into the packed dirt street of the town with her leather bag in one hand and her bearings still largely intact. She had been told that Mr. Townsend would meet her at the stage office, and she stood for a moment adjusting her coat and scanning the small crowd of people who had gathered in the way that people in small towns always gather whenever anything arrives from the outside world. She was looking for a rancher, and she had a general idea in her mind of what a rancher in the Arizona Territory might look like, formed from newspaper accounts and the kind of second-hand stories that circulate in eastern cities about the West. Jonas Townsend was not what she had imagined. He was tall, which she had expected, but there was a quality to his stillness as he stood at the edge of the crowd that she had not anticipated. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with dark hair and a jaw that held tension the way stone walls hold cold, and he was watching her with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not warm either. It was simply careful. He had the look of a man who assessed everything before committing to anything, and he was assessing her now with a directness that most men Grace had encountered would have softened with a smile or a tip of the hat. He did tip his hat finally when she walked toward him. He said, "Miss Easton," in a voice that was low and carried no unnecessary syllables. She said, "Mr. Townsend." They shook hands. His grip was firm without being performative. He said, "You had a good journey," she said, "long, but yes." Yes. He nodded as though this were satisfactory, and then he took her bag from her hand before she had quite decided whether to let him, and he led her to a buckboard wagon waiting at the edge of the street, and they drove the 6 miles to the Townsend ranch in almost complete silence, which suited Grace entirely. The ranch was larger than she had expected. The main house was a long, low adobe structure with a deep covered porch that ran along the front, and behind it were a barn, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse for the 3 ranch hands Jonas employed, and a series of corrals where horses moved with that particular liquid quality of well-kept animals. The land stretched flat and wide in every direction, interrupted by distant red rock formations and the thin silver line of a seasonal creek to the west. Eli had been waiting on the porch steps when they arrived. He was 7 years old then, with his father's dark hair and a watchfulness that was his own particular quality, and he had looked at Grace with the kind of serious evaluation that children deploy when they understand that someone new is about to change the shape of their daily life. He had not smiled, but he had said good evening with a politeness that told Grace someone had trained him well, and she had thought, not for the first time that day, that this situation was going to be more complicated than the letter in her coat pocket had suggested. The first weeks at the Townsend ranch were a process of negotiation that played out largely without words. Grace established herself in the 2 rooms at the east end of the house that Jonas had designated for her use, and she began Eli's lessons in the mornings and managed the household in the afternoons, and she cooked supper in the evenings using the cast iron range in the kitchen that was newer and better maintained than she had expected. Jonas ate at the table with her and Eli each evening and said perhaps 20 words per meal, and Grace said what was necessary and no more, and Eli sat between them like a small, watchful mediator who was still making up his mind about the situation. What Grace noticed in those early weeks was that the ranch ran on a kind of quiet efficiency that spoke of Jonas Townsend's competence, but there were gaps in it, absences where a woman's steady management had once existed and now was felt by its lack. The house was clean but not warm. The kitchen was functional but not nourishing. Eli was fed and clothed and physically cared for, but there was a loneliness in him that settled around him like dust settles around everything in Arizona, quietly, constantly, until you realize it has been there all along. Grace began to understand slowly that this loneliness had a specific origin. Eli's mother had died. She had known this from the placement agency's notes, stated matter-of-factly as a reason the position existed. But the manner of that death and the circumstances around it were something Jonas Townsend clearly held close under lock and key, and the silence around it in the house was not the ordinary silence of grief moved through, but something denser and more troubled. It had the quality of a secret being kept, and Grace, who had been burned by hidden truths before, felt its presence the way you feel a change in weather before the sky shows it. She did not press for answers. She had learned, expensively, that pressing rarely produced the truth from someone determined to keep it. She watched instead, and she waited, and she came to know the shape of Jonas Townsend's silences the way you come to know the layout of a house in the dark, by moving carefully and paying attention to where things hurt when you walk into them. What she saw was a man carrying something that was bending him slowly. He was attentive to Eli in a way that was almost fierce, as if the boy were a fixed point he was navigating by. He was fair with his ranch hands, a Mexican-American man named Pedro Reyes who had worked the land since before Jonas bought it, and 2 younger men from Texas named Will and Thomas Cord, brothers who bickered constantly and worked hard. Jonas was respected in redemption. She gathered from the weekly trips to town for supplies, but he was not a man anyone seemed to know well. He was the kind of man a town relies on and does not fully understand. By May, Grace had been at the ranch for 6 weeks, and something had begun to shift in the architecture of her days that she was not entirely sure how to account for. She had begun to look for Jonas at the supper table before he came in from the evening work, and she had begun to notice things about him that she was not certain she had intended to notice. The way he looked at Eli when the boy was reading, with an expression so unguarded it was almost painful to witness. The way he held his coffee mug in both hands in the morning, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the land as if he were having a conversation with it that no one else was invited to hear. The way he had, just once, picked up the book Grace had left on the kitchen table the evening before and read the passage she had marked and set it down again without a word. She told herself she was simply observing. She was a careful woman who observed things. That was all. Then came the evening of the late May thunderstorm, which rolled across the valley with the kind of speed and violence that the Arizona sky deploys when it has decided to make a point. And Eli woke screaming from a nightmare at 10 o'clock at night, and Grace was in the hallway with a candle before she had fully registered moving from her bed. She found Jonas already in Eli's doorway, having come from the other end of the house, and they stood for a moment in the narrow hallway with the thunder cracking overhead and the candle making their shadows enormous on the adobe wall. And Jonas looked at her with an expression that was nothing like his customary careful guardedness. He looked for just a moment like a man who was exhausted down to the marrow of himself. Grace said, quietly, "I'll sit with him," and the look that moved through Jonas's eyes before he nodded and stepped back was something she carried with her for a long time afterward. She sat with Eli until the storm passed and the boy slept, and when she came out of his room at past midnight, Jonas was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee already poured, and he said, without looking up from his cup, "I expect you have questions." Grace sat down across from him. She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. She said, "I have had questions since I arrived." He was quiet for a long time. The storm had passed on and the night outside was very still now, the way Arizona nights are after a storm, as if the whole land is catching its breath. Then Jonas Townsend told her about Catherine. Catherine had been his wife, Eli's mother. They had married in 1874, when Jonas was 23 and Catherine was 21, and they had come west together from Virginia with the intention of building something out of the raw material of the frontier. And they had built it, the land, the house, the herd, the life. But Catherine had been a woman who carried a restlessness inside her, a yearning for something she could not name and Jonas could not provide. And by 1880, the marriage had become a painful, silent exercise in 2 people who loved each other inadequately for what the other required. There had been a man. Jonas said this with the flat precision of someone who had made peace with a fact without making peace with the pain of it. A traveling man, a land speculator from back east who had come through redemption in the summer of 1880, and Catherine had been drawn into a correspondence with him that had become something else, and Jonas had discovered it in the autumn of that year, and the period that followed had been the kind of darkness that a person either comes through or doesn't. They had tried to rebuild. For Eli's sake, for the sake of whatever love was still living in the wreckage of their marriage, they had tried. And then in the winter of 1882, Catherine had gotten sick with a fever that took hold fast and hard, and she had died in January of 1883, when Eli was 6, and the man from back east had not known she was dead and had written to her again in February of that year. And Jonas had read the letter because it came to the ranch addressed to his wife, and the letter had revealed that the correspondence had never fully ended. He sat with that for a while before he said anything else, and Grace sat with him in the quiet kitchen and did not fill the silence with false comfort. Then Jonas said, "I am not a man who trusts easily. I expect that is apparent." Grace said, "It is apparent." He said, "I did not mean for it to make your situation here a difficult one." She said, "It has not been difficult. It has simply been honest." He looked at her then directly, and it was one of those moments that a person can trace back to afterward as the moment something changed. She went to bed an hour later and she lay awake in the copper-colored dark of the Arizona night, and she told herself very firmly that she was an employee in this household, and that Jonas Townsend's sorrows were his own to carry, and that she was not in the business of collecting other people's broken truths and trying to fit them back together. She had done that once. She knew where it led. but she fell asleep thinking about the way he had looked at her across the kitchen table. The summer of 1884 in the Arizona Territory was ferociously hot, the kind of heat that compresses time and makes everything feel simultaneously urgent and suspended. Grace fell into the rhythm of the ranch with a completeness that surprised her. She expanded Eli's lessons to include not just reading and arithmetic but geography and history, and the natural sciences, using books she ordered through the dry goods store in Redemption that kept a catalog from a publisher in Denver. Eli was a remarkably quick student, hungry for knowledge in a way that reminded Grace of herself at that age, and the transformation in him over the course of the summer, from the watchful, guarded child of March to a boy who would argue passionately about the migratory patterns of birds or the causes of the recent conflicts between the United States government and the Apache people, was one of the most satisfying things Grace had ever witnessed professionally. She raised that last topic carefully. The Apache Wars were not ancient history in 1884. Geronimo and his band were still at large in the region, and the tension between the army, the white settlers, and the indigenous people of the territory was present in Redemption the way weather is present, always a background condition, shaping everything without always being named. She thought it mattered that Eli understand the full complexity of what surrounded him, rather than the simplified version that many of his contemporaries were being taught. And Jonas, when he overheard one of these lessons through the kitchen window one afternoon, did not object. In fact, Jonas appeared at the kitchen doorway that evening and said that he had been thinking about what she had said to Eli about the land disputes, and he thought she was right that the boy should understand it properly. And Grace said she was glad he agreed. And then they had a conversation that lasted 2 hours and ranged from the current territorial policies to the literature of the American frontier, to the particular challenges of raising cattle in an arid climate. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Grace realized that she was laughing at something Jonas had said, a genuine, unguarded laugh, and that he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. He looked almost startled by his own happiness. After that, the evenings changed. After Eli was in bed, Jonas and Grace fell into the habit of sitting together at the kitchen table or on the front porch when the evenings were cool enough, talking with the particular freedom that comes when two careful people have decided, without formally deciding, that the other one is safe to be honest with. Jonas spoke about his early years in Virginia, about coming west with Catherine, about the slow, complicated building of the ranch. Grace spoke about Memphis, about St. Louis, about the man she had planned to marry and the hidden debts, and the letter she had found in a desk drawer that had dismantled everything she thought she was building. She had not told anyone the full shape of that story before, and the telling of it to Jonas in the late Arizona evenings felt like setting down something heavy that she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its weight. What she noticed was that Jonas listened the way people listen, when they are genuinely receiving what you say rather than waiting for their turn to speak. He asked questions that went to the center of things. When she told him about the man from Memphis and the betrayal, he said after a pause, "Did you blame yourself for not seeing it?" And the question reached into something so specific that she had to be quiet for a moment before she could answer. She said, "I blamed myself for trusting him." Jonas said, "That is not the same thing as being at fault." She looked at him across the porch in the dark, with the insects doing their constant August work in the brush beyond the corrals, and she said, "No. It took me a while to understand that," he said. "It took me longer," and she knew they were no longer talking about Memphis. But there was a boundary being maintained, carefully, by both of them, with the same kind of unspoken mutual understanding that they had brought to most of their arrangements since the beginning. Grace was his employee. There was a proper order to things. Jonas was a man recovering from a specific wound, and Grace was a woman who had sworn to herself that she would never again walk into a situation without understanding it fully first, and neither of them was ready to step across the careful line they had drawn. Then autumn came and brought with it a letter. The letter arrived on a September morning on the stage, addressed to Grace in a hand she recognized from 2 years of distance. It was from a woman named Margaret Howell, who had been Grace's closest friend in St. Louis, and it contained news that cracked through Grace's carefully maintained composure like the first fracture in a frozen river. The man from Memphis, his name was Arthur Langley, and he had been in St. Louis. Margaret had seen him. He was looking for Grace, Margaret wrote, and she thought Grace should know. And she thought Grace should also know that Arthur Langley had a very particular reason for finding her, which was that the property dispute that had destroyed Grace's family's finances in Memphis had recently been ruled on by a court, and there was money owed, a settlement amount that belonged in part to Grace, and Arthur Langley had positioned himself, through means that Margaret did not fully understand but found alarming, to be the one who would contact Grace and manage the disbursement of whatever she was owed. Grace read this letter 3 times at the kitchen table while Jonas was out with the cattle and Eli was working on his morning arithmetic, and when she put it down her hands were not entirely steady. She understood immediately what the letter meant. Arthur Langley had a secret motive for finding her, one wrapped in money, and the kind of legal manipulation that she had encountered in his orbit before. The settlement could potentially represent a significant sum, and if he reached her first, framed himself as the intermediary, and she was sufficiently isolated in the Arizona territory to be uninformed about her legal standing, he could very easily maneuver her into a position that served his interests rather than hers. The trap was elegant. She could see its shape clearly, which was both a gift and a source of cold fury. But there was a second thing the letter forced her to confront, and it was this. She had not told Jonas Townsend about this part of her past. She had told him about the betrayal in general terms, about the collapsed finances and the shattered engagement, but she had not told him about the money that might still be in dispute, and she had not told him that her presence in Redemption, in Arizona, so far removed from the world she had come from, could be construed as hiding. She had told herself it was not hiding. She had told herself it was simply beginning again. She wondered, sitting at the kitchen table in the September morning light, whether Jonas would see it that way. She was still sitting there, the letter in her hands, when Jonas came in from the East Range at noon. He read her expression the moment he came through the kitchen door, the way he had learned to read the things she kept in her face rather than in her words. He stopped. He said, "What has happened?" She showed him the letter. He read it without comment. He set it on the table. He stood looking at it for a moment, then he sat down across from her and he said, "Tell me the rest of it." So she told him the rest. All of it, the full account of Arthur Langley, the full account of the money and the property dispute, and the legal tangle that she had walked away from rather than fight her way through because she had been 24 years old and exhausted and frightened, and there had not been anyone standing beside her at the time. When she finished, Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You did not trust me enough to tell me this before." The words were not accusatory. They were simply a statement of fact delivered by a man who understood exactly what it meant when information was withheld. Grace said, "No, I did not. I am sorry for that." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite decipher, and then he said, "I'll write to a lawyer I know in Tucson. He is a capable man. This can be handled properly, and Langley will not be permitted to insert himself as an intermediary if you make your claim directly through your own counsel." She said, "Jonas, I don't want to be a trouble to you." He said, with a flatness that was somehow more reassuring than warmth would have been, "You are not a trouble to me, Miss Easton." She hired the lawyer in Tucson. His name was Edmund Hayes, and he was indeed capable, and over the following 2 months he managed the correspondence with the court in Memphis and confirmed that Grace was owed $412 in the settlement, and that Arthur Langley had no legal standing in the matter whatsoever, and that his attempts to position himself otherwise were being noted. Grace wrote to inform Arthur Langley directly that she was represented by counsel and that any further communication should be directed to Mr. Edmund Hayes of Tucson, Arizona Territory. She did not read his reply. She handed it to Mr. Hayes unopened. The $412 arrived by bank draft in November, and Grace held it in her hands for a long time before she deposited it at the redemption bank, and the feeling she had was not triumph, exactly, but something steadier. Something like closure, though she had long since stopped expecting that word to mean what people seemed to want it to mean. What she did not fully account for, in the midst of managing this resolution, was what it would do to the dynamic between her and Jonas. He had helped her, not in the showy, overreaching way that would have made her feel obligated and small, but in the precise, competent way of a person who sees a problem and addresses it because it is the right thing to do. And in helping her, he had revealed something about himself that his silences and his careful guardedness had kept largely hidden, which was that Jonas Townsend was, at his core, a man whose deepest instinct was to protect the people in his orbit, not from sentiment, not from obligation, but from a genuine and inarticulate commitment to their well-being. Grace started looking at him differently after that. Or perhaps more accurately, she started permitting herself to look at him the way she had been carefully not looking since approximately May. It was Eli who noticed first, with the ruthless perceptiveness of children. He said to Grace, one afternoon in December while they were working on a history lesson about the Lewis and Clark expedition, "Miss Grace, do you like my father?" Grace set down her pen with great precision. She said, "I respect your father very much, Eli." Eli considered this. He said, "I think he likes you too. He looks at you like he looks at the land in the morning, like it matters a lot." Grace did not have an immediate answer for this, and Eli, apparently satisfied with having delivered this observation, returned to his geography exercise. That evening, Grace sat on the front porch in the December cold, which in Arizona Territory is more temperate than December cold in most places but still carries enough chill to make the stars look sharp and close, and she thought about what Eli had said. She thought about the way Jonas had looked at her across the kitchen table when she had been explaining Edmund Hayes's last letter. She thought about the way he had stood in the corridor outside Eli's room on the night of the storm with exhaustion written all over his face, and the complicated gratitude in his expression when she had offered to sit with the boy. She thought about the fact that she had, sometime between March and December of 1884, stopped thinking of the Townsend Ranch as a temporary posting and started thinking of it as home. That realization terrified her considerably more than Arthur Langley had. Because here was what she knew about herself. She had trusted before, and she had been wrong, and the cost of being wrong had been everything she had built. She had come to Arizona with the explicit intention of not building anything that could be taken from her again. She was employed here. She was useful here. She was, by any reasonable measure, safe. But safety and home are not the same thing, and she had begun to feel the difference between them the way you feel a splinter you cannot see. She went inside and began the process of telling herself all the reasons why feeling what she felt about Jonas Townsend was a mistake, and she was relatively good at this exercise, and she managed it successfully for approximately 2 weeks. Then Jonas asked her if she would stay. It was a January evening in 1885, and they were sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them and the night pressing in at the windows. And the conversation had been moving through the usual channels, the ranch business, Eli's progress with his lessons, a planned trip to Tucson in the spring, and then Jonas set his coffee cup down with a deliberateness that she recognized as the precursor to something considered, and he said, "Your contract with the agency runs until March." She said, "Yes," he said, looking at his coffee cup rather than at her. "I would like you to stay on beyond that, if it suits you." She said carefully, "In what capacity, Mr. Townsend?" There was a pause so full of specific weight that Grace could feel it pressing against her sternum. Then Jonas looked up and said, in the same low, careful voice he used for everything that mattered, in whatever capacity you are willing to consider. And the wall she had been maintaining so carefully, the professional one, the self-protective one, the one built of Memphis and St. Louis and all the burned bridges of her earlier self, shifted about 3 inches on its foundation. She said, "That is not a simple question to answer." He said, "I know," she said. "There are things about me that you know and things that you don't, and some of what you don't know might change what you think." He said, "I expect the same is true of me," she said. "What happened with Catherine?" She stopped. She said, "I have to understand that before anything else. I have to understand it because I need to know that you have moved through it and not around it." The silence that came after that was the longest one she had ever witnessed from him. Finally, he said, "I blamed myself for a long time, for not being what she needed, for not seeing what was missing, for letting the marriage become what it became." He paused. "I have come to understand that 2 people can love each other and still be entirely wrong for each other, and that wrongness is not always a failure. Sometimes it is simply a truth." He looked at her. "She is dead, and I grieve her, but what I grieve is not the marriage. I grieve that she died unhappy and that Eli did not have more time with her." Grace held that for a moment. Then she said, "That is an honest answer." He said, "It is the only kind I know how to give." She stayed. What happened between January and April of 1885 was the slow, careful, fiercely intentional process of 2 people choosing each other, not in the impulsive way of people who mistake proximity for understanding, but in the deliberate way of people who have been burned and learned what fire actually means, and are choosing to approach this one differently. They talked. They talked more in those 3 months than most people talk in years, about everything that had shaped them, every dark corner, every hidden fear, every hope that had been packed away for safekeeping and not taken out in a long time. Jonas told her things about his years in Virginia that he had not told anyone in Redemption. He told her about his father, a hard man who had expressed love through expectation and never through tenderness, and how Jonas had carried that model into his marriage with Catherine without fully understanding that silence is not strength. It is simply silence. He told her about the years after Catherine's betrayal, when he had thrown himself into the ranch with the specific intensity of a man who is trying to outwork grief, and how Eli had been the thing that kept him from disappearing entirely into that work. Grace told him about the person she had been before Memphis, a girl who had believed unreservedly in the reliability of the people she loved, and the process of becoming a woman who trusted carefully rather than openly, and how she was not entirely sure that was a better thing to be even if it was a safer one. Jonas said, "I think you can learn to trust carefully and still be open to being surprised." She said, "Is that what you have been doing?" He said, "Trying." On an April evening when the desert was exploding into the brief, riotous bloom that follows the winter rains, and the air smelled of ironwood blossoms and rain-clean earth, Jonas Townsend asked Grace Easton if she would consent to become his wife. He did not say it dramatically. He said it the way he said all the most important things, quietly, precisely, and with his full attention on her face. He said he understood if she needed time to consider it, and he said that he was asking not because he required a housekeeper or a governess, but because she had become, over the course of the past year, the person he understood his life in relation to, and that was not a thing he had expected, and it was not a thing he took lightly. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You understand that I am a woman with opinions and a great deal of stubbornness, and a tendency to manage situations myself, even when you might prefer to be consulted." He said, with the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him, "I noticed those qualities approximately 4 days after you arrived." She said, "And you are asking anyway." He said, "Because of them, not in spite of them." She said, "Yes." Eli, who had apparently been listening from the hallway, made a sound of pure satisfaction and ran back to his room before either adult could address him about the eavesdropping. They were married in redemption in May of 1885, in the small Methodist church on the main street, with Pedro Reyes and his wife Carmen attending, and the Cord brothers cleaning up considerably for the occasion, and the redemption pastor, a man named Reverend Whitmore who had christened Eli, performing the ceremony with genuine warmth. Grace wore her blue dress with the pearl buttons, which Eli pointed out very seriously was the right dress for the occasion, and Jonas wore his good dark coat and looked at Grace across the small church, with an expression so unguarded that Carmen Reyes, who was a perceptive woman, leaned over to her husband and whispered something in Spanish that made him smile. But a wedding, as Grace well knew, is not the same thing as a marriage, and a marriage between two people who have each been through the particular kind of fire they had each been through is not a simple or uncomplicated thing to build, no matter how deliberately and honestly they go about it. The complications arrived in the form of summer. The summer of 1885 was harder than the previous one. There was a sustained dry spell across the Arizona territory that cracked the seasonal creek to the west down to nearly nothing, and stressed the cattle herd with an intensity that required Jonas and his men to work hours that left him hollowed out and short-tempered in the evenings. The drought affected not just the ranch but the whole community, and in towns and settlements across the territory the pressure was felt in different ways, through conflicts over water rights, through the heightened tension between ranchers and smaller farmers, through the general irritability of a landscape being pushed past its natural limits. Jonas was not a cruel man, but under sustained pressure he became a closed-down man, which was, Grace discovered, its own particular kind of difficulty. He retreated into the silence she had first known him through, the one she had since learned to read as pain being managed rather than absence of feeling, but knowing what it was did not make it easier to live alongside. She would speak to him in the evenings and he would answer in the way that was technically responsive and felt entirely elsewhere, and she would remind herself that she knew this was not about her, that it was about water rights and dying grass and the weight of a man's livelihood balanced on the edge of a dry summer, and the reminding helped, but not entirely. The first time she packed the bag, it was in July. It was not premeditated. It was the end of a week in which Jonas had barely looked at her, in which Eli had been difficult with his lessons in the particular way that children are difficult when they sense that the adults around them are carrying something heavy, and in which the heat had been unrelenting, and Grace had woken at 2 in the morning 3 nights running with her heart hammering, and the old Memphis fear sitting on her chest like something solid. She had gotten out of bed at 2 in the morning on the 4th night, walked to the bedroom and begun to pack the leather bag. She was not fully rational about it. She understood that. She had gotten to the blue dress and the gray before she stopped and sat on the edge of the bed and asked herself what she was actually doing, and the answer was that she was frightened, not of Jonas but of her own need for him, and that fright had translated itself into the old reflex, the one that said that leaving before you are left is the only way to survive being left. She sat there for a long time in the dark. Then she unpacked the bag herself, methodically, one item at a time, and she got back into bed, and in the morning she was still there. But Jonas had seen the bag. He had come in from the barn before dawn, as he sometimes did when the nights were too hot to sleep through, and he had passed the open bedroom door, and he had seen the bag half-packed on the bed with Grace asleep beside it, and he had understood what it meant without being told. He did not say anything about it immediately. This was very Jonas. He held it for 2 days, and then on the 3rd evening, after Eli was in bed, he said, "You were thinking of going." She said, "Yes." He said, "Will you tell me why?" She told him. All of it, the 2 a.m. fear, the Memphis reflex, the way his withdrawal had felt even though she knew what it was. She told him with the directness that had become the foundation of everything between them, because she had promised herself when she said yes to his proposal that she would not do what had been done to her. She would not keep secrets. She would not build walls with things left unspoken. When she finished, Jonas sat quietly for a moment, And then he said something that cost him something to say. She could see that, the visible effort of a man pushing against his own deep-rooted reticence. He said, "I close down when I'm afraid. I always have. And what I have been afraid of this summer is losing the ranch, which is Eli's future, which is everything I have been building toward since Catherine died. And I let that fear make me absent from you, and I am sorry for it." She said, "I need you to tell me when you are afraid, Jonas, not manage it alone in the dark and expect me not to notice." He said, "I know. I am learning." She said, "So am I." The drought broke in September. Rain came across the valley on a Thursday afternoon with a grandeur that felt like an apology, and the whole ranch seemed to exhale. And Jonas came in from the range that evening soaked to the skin and laughing in a way Grace had not heard from him before. A full, unguarded laugh with nothing held back, and he picked her up off the kitchen floor and spun her once. And Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway and watched this with the expression of a child who has gotten exactly what he wanted without quite having had to ask for it. They settled into the second year of their marriage with a sureness that had been earned rather than assumed. Grace continued Eli's lessons through the autumn and into the winter, and Eli continued to grow into himself in the way that good teaching and steady love produce, becoming a boy who was curious and articulate and possessed of a kindness toward others that Grace recognized as something Jonas had always had but rarely showed. She ordered more books from Denver. She began writing letters to a woman's educational organization in Phoenix about the possibility of establishing a lending library in Redemption, which was a larger project than she had originally intended when she wrote the first letter, but which had taken on a momentum of its own that she found satisfying. Jonas began, gradually, to be less of a closed door during the hard times. She would find him in the evenings, sometimes standing at the kitchen window with the particular stance that meant something was weighing on him, and she would stand beside him and not say anything immediately, and after a moment he would tell her. Not always fluently, not always with every word in its right place. But he would tell her, and she would listen, and they would think through it together, and the shared thinking was, they discovered, considerably more effective than either of them thinking alone. The letter from Memphis arrived on a February morning in 1886. It was from a lawyer Grace did not recognize, writing on behalf of a relative she had lost contact with during the years of family collapse, a cousin named Albert Easton, who had apparently kept better track of the property dispute than Grace had realized, and who had some additional information relevant to the original settlement, information that he believed would result in Grace being owed a further sum, potentially significant, if she were willing to pursue it. Grace read this letter with the practiced eye of a woman who had already navigated one such situation, and who understood that letters from strangers in Memphis bearing good news about money required careful verification before anyone's hopes were raised. She wrote to Edmund Hayes in Tucson immediately, forwarding a copy of the letter, and asking him to verify the identity of the lawyer in question and the legitimacy of the cousin's claim. The reply from Hayes came 3 weeks later and confirmed that the lawyer was legitimate, that Albert Easton was indeed her cousin, and that the claim had some merit, though the amount was unclear and the process would take some time. She told Jonas about this over supper that evening, and he said, with perfect equanimity, "Then we will let Hayes manage it and wait." She said, "You are not going to ask me why I did not mention I had a cousin still in Memphis." He said, "You have a number of relatives I have not met. I don't imagine you have withheld them with any dark intent." She laughed, and he looked pleased with himself in the way he occasionally allowed himself to look when he had made her laugh. The second time she packed the bag was October 1886, and it came from a different source entirely. The town of Redemption had grown through the years Grace had been there, and growth brings complications along with opportunity. A new saloon had opened on the south end of the main street, owned by a man named Clifford Hale, who had come up from the silver mining country around Tombstone, and who had brought with him a certain style of frontier enterprise that Grace found distasteful and Jonas found troublesome. There had been fights, a stabbing in November, and ongoing tension between the rougher element that Hale's establishment attracted and the more settled community that Redemption was trying to be. None of this was directly relevant to Grace until the evening in October when she was in the Redemption General Store and Clifford Hale came in and said something to her, in front of 3 other people, that was so specifically designed to diminish and humiliate that she had not had a response ready, because she had not imagined someone would say such a thing aloud. What he said was this, that he had heard Miss Grace Easton, as he pointedly called her rather than Mrs. Townsend, had once been kept by a man in Memphis who had paid off her debts, and that it was interesting how a woman like that always found herself a comfortable arrangement. The 3 other people in the store were Mrs. Pearl Whitmore, the Reverend's wife, old Mr. Hadley who ran the feed store, and a young ranch hand named Dawes who worked for the neighboring Carver spread. All 3 of them stood absolutely still in the way people stand when something ugly has happened in a public space, and they do not know what protocol applies. Grace had looked at Clifford Hale with the steadiest gaze she had ever deployed, and she had said, in a voice she was very proud of later, "I suggest you reconsider what you believe you know about me, Mr. Hale," and she had paid for her goods and walked out of the store. She had driven the buckboard back to the ranch without crying. She had unhitched the horse, put away the goods, and made supper, and over supper she had not said anything about it, and after Eli was in bed she had gone to the bedroom and packed the bag. Not to leave. She knew that, even in the moment. But she needed to feel the action in her hands, needed to perform the motion that said, "I can leave. I have always been able to leave. No one has me trapped here," because what Clifford Hale had said had made her feel, for the length of the store visit and the drive home, like a woman defined by someone else's story about her. Jonas found her with the bag half-packed this time too. He came in from the porch where he had been sitting with his evening coffee, and he stood in the doorway and he said, very quietly, "What happened?" Not a question, a statement. He knew something had happened. She told him. She told him every word of it, Hale's exact phrasing, the other people in the store, her response, the drive home. She told it flat and clean without editorializing. When she finished, Jonas was very still for a long moment. Then he said, "I will speak to Hale." Grace said, "Jonas, that is not what I need." He said, "Then what do you need?" She said, "I need you to tell me that you know exactly who I am and that his version of me has nothing to do with the truth." Jonas crossed the room and sat down on the edge of the bed beside the half-packed bag, and he said, looking at her directly, "Grace, I know exactly who you are. I have known you for 2 years. You are the most honest, capable, and frankly formidable person I have ever had the privilege of sharing my life with, and anything Clifford Hale says about you originates in his own ignorance and has no more bearing on who you are than a dog's bark changes what the moon is." She stared at him for a moment. Then she said, "Formidable," he said with complete seriousness, "extremely." She unpacked the bag. Jonas did speak to Clifford Hale, but not with fists, which was what she had feared and which would have been both satisfying and counterproductive. He spoke to him with the quiet, specific authority of a man who holds real standing in a community and understands how to use that standing without resorting to theater. He did it in the presence of 2 other respected men in Redemption, Mr. Carl Bishop, who ran the bank, and the county sheriff, a methodical man named Rutherford. Hale did not apologize. Men like that rarely do, but he understood that there were social and economic costs to the path he had chosen, and Clifford Hale, whatever else he was practical. He did not speak about Grace again in public, and the incident subsided, but its effects lingered in Grace in ways she had to consciously address, because it had touched something she thought she had dealt with, the question of how much of her own story she actually controlled versus how much was always at risk of being rewritten by other people. She talked about this with Jonas over several evenings in October and November, And those conversations were some of the most important they had ever had, because they moved through territory that was not just about Hale, but about the whole architecture of how each of them understood identity and authority, and the specific vulnerabilities that come with being a woman in 1886. Jonas listened, and he thought, and he said things that surprised her, things that demonstrated that he had been thinking about the unequal weights that the world placed on men and women, and that he found those inequalities genuinely troubling rather than simply a background condition of existence. She had not expected this from him, and she told him so, and he said that when you spend 2 years sharing a house and a life with a woman who is consistently more capable than most of the men in her vicinity, it becomes difficult to maintain comfortable assumptions about the natural order of things. She loved him. She realized, in the full, undisguised, permanent way that she had been trying to hold at arm's length since approximately May of the previous year, and the recognition of it, when it finally arrived completely, felt less like a revelation than like something she had known for a long time and had been too careful to name. She told him. Directly, on a November evening when the light was coming through the kitchen windows at the long, flat angle of late autumn, and Eli was at the table doing his lessons and the smell of the beef stew Grace had made was filling the whole house, she looked at Jonas and said, "I love you. I want you to know that. I mean it in the full sense of the word and not in any qualified or provisional way." Jonas had been quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was receiving something important. Then he had said, with that completeness that she had learned to recognize as the highest form of his sincerity, "I have loved you since approximately the first morning I watched you explain to my 7-year-old son that the world was more complicated than most people were willing to acknowledge, and that complication was not something to fear but something to learn." She said, "That was April." He said, "Yes." She said, "You waited a year and a half." He said, "I was being careful." She said, "That is deeply annoying." He said, "I know." Eli from the table said, without looking up from his arithmetic, "I told Miss Grace you liked her in December. That is when it should have happened." Grace and Jonas both looked at him, and then at each other, and the laughter that came out of them was the full, unguarded kind that fills a room completely. The spring of 1887 brought news that Grace had been both anticipating and not quite letting herself hope for. Edmund Hayes wrote from Tucson to inform her that Albert Easton's claim had been verified, and that upon full review of the original Memphis property records, Grace was owed an additional sum of $188, representing her portion of the final settlement. Hayes had arranged for the bank draft to be sent directly to the redemption bank. Grace received this news and sat with it for a moment at the kitchen table. The money was not enormous, but it was hers, extracted from the wreckage of her family's past by the patient, specific work of good legal counsel, and there was something about having it fully resolved that felt like a final accounting. The thread back to Memphis was settled. The debt was closed. Arthur Langley had been removed from the equation entirely, and the cousin she had not known was still tracking these things had turned out to be an honest man. She told Jonas the money was coming, and he said, "What will you do with it?" She said she had been thinking about the lending library. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "That is exactly the right thing to do with it." The Redemption Public Lending Library, which opened in September of 1887 in a single room attached to the back of the general store, with 63 books donated from various sources and the promise of more from the Denver publisher's catalog, was a modest institution by any Eastern standard. But in a town of 400 people in the Arizona Territory in 1887, it was not modest at all. It was a statement about what a community could be, and it was built, entirely, by one woman's conviction that the people around her deserved access to the same knowledge and enrichment that she had spent her life pursuing. The opening drew half the town, which astonished Grace and moved her more than she showed. Eli was there in his good clothes, having made a sign for the door in his careful schoolboy print, and Jonas stood at the back of the small room and watched the people of redemption move through the newly organized shelves with an expression that Grace caught only once before he could collect it, and it was the expression that told her with certainty that she had been right about what she had been given when she had chosen to stay. They had been married 2 years. Grace was 29. Jonas was 35. Eli was 11 and growing into someone remarkable. And in November of 1887, Grace sat Jonas down at the kitchen table with the particular expression that told him immediately that what she was about to say was something significant, and she told him that they were going to have a baby. The stillness that came over him was absolute and complete, and it lasted long enough that she said, carefully, "Jonas." He looked up at her with the kind of unguarded emotion that she had learned to recognize as the truest version of him, the one underneath all the careful, quiet management, and he said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "When?" she said, "May, I think." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and he held it, and he did not say anything for a long moment, and Grace let the silence be exactly what it was, which was a man sitting with the full reality of something he had hoped for and not quite allowed himself to believe in. Then he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" she said. "I am very well. I am tired, and the smell of coffee has been disagreeable for about 3 weeks, which is why I have not been making it in the mornings." He said, with a flash of the dry humor she had come to love in him, "I thought I had done something to offend you." She laughed. She said, "Only the coffee." Eli's response when they told him the following evening was to sit very still for a moment and then say, with grave seriousness, "I would like a brother, please." And then, as an afterthought, "But a sister would also be acceptable." The winter of 1887 passed in a warmth that had nothing to do with climate. Grace continued the library and Eli's lessons through February, and Jonas managed the ranch through the cold months with the focused attention of a man who had a particular reason to want things to go well. And in the evenings, the three of them sat around the kitchen table and talked and read and were, in the simple and irreducible sense of the word, a family. The third time Grace packed the bag was in March of 1888, and it was, of all the times, the one that was most serious and most painful, and it was the one that changed everything finally and completely. It had begun with a visit to redemption by a man named Samuel Easton, not a cousin, an uncle, her father's younger brother, who had been a distant presence throughout Grace's childhood and who had not featured at all in her adult life. He had tracked her down through the Memphis settlement records, in which her new name and address had appeared following the legal resolution of the property dispute, and he had arrived on the stage on a Wednesday afternoon in March looking like a man who had been traveling hard and carrying grievances of long standing. Samuel Easton was 51 years old and had the face of a man who had spent decades believing the world owed him better than it had delivered. He came to the ranch on Thursday morning, having spent the night at the Redemption Hotel, and Grace met him on the front porch with Jonas at her side, and she could see immediately that Samuel Easton was not here out of family affection or concern for her well-being. He was here because of the money. Specifically, he was here because he had been expecting a portion of the Memphis settlement to come to him, through means that he had apparently been relying on, and that had not materialized. And he had concluded, by a chain of reasoning that Grace followed but found entirely without merit, that Grace had somehow interfered with his anticipated share. The $412 she had received and the subsequent $188 from Albert's claim had apparently been portions of a larger sum that Samuel had long considered, without legal basis, to be partly his. He was angry. He was the kind of angry that comes from years of grievance accumulated on a foundation of genuine injustice mixed with a substantial amount of personal failure. And when people carry that kind, they tend to aim it at whoever is closest and most obviously better situated than they are. In this case, that was Grace, who had built a life in the Arizona territory while Samuel had apparently been running through whatever resources he had in Memphis. The conversation on the porch that Thursday morning was ugly in the way that family confrontations can be ugly, full of old names and old wounds and things said with the specific venom that requires years of marination. Samuel said that Grace had always been their father's favorite, that she had been given advantages that Samuel had been denied, that the money from the settlement was morally if not legally his in part, and that her failure to recognize this was proof of the selfishness he had always seen in her. Grace stood through all of this with her hands folded in front of her and her face composed, because she had been prepared for something like this. Not specifically, but in general, because she had been prepared for most things since Memphis. And she said, when Samuel finally ran down, that the settlement had been legally determined, and that she had received her lawful portion and no more, that she held no ill will toward him for his financial difficulties, that she would not be providing him with money that was hers by law and necessity, and that she wished him well on his return journey. Samuel looked at her with a hot, bitter fury, and then he looked at Jonas, and he said something about Grace that was not true, and was said specifically to wound in the way that only a family member can wound, using details of the old Memphis story that he had collected or fabricated in the way that people fabricate when they need a version of the truth that justifies their anger. Jonas said, very quietly, "That is enough." Samuel looked at him. Jonas said, still very quietly, "You have been offered civility and courtesy by my wife. If you have a legal claim against the settlement, you may pursue it through a lawyer, and you will lose because there is no such claim. If you are here because you need money, I am not without resources, and I will give you what I can for the return journey as an act of basic human decency, with no conditions attached. But if you say another word against my wife on my property, the conversation is over." Samuel Easton looked between the two of them for a long moment. Then he said with a bitter precision, "You always did find a man to take care of you, didn't you, Grace?" Jonas said, "Leave." Samuel left. Grace stood on the porch until the man had walked back down the road toward redemption, and she was absolutely still, and her face was composed, and her hands were folded in front of her. Then she walked into the house and she walked to the bedroom and she opened the leather bag and she began to pack it. She was 7 months pregnant. She was not rational about this. She knew that. She was 7 months pregnant, and her uncle had just used the story of her life against her in the exact form that Arthur Langley had always threatened to. The version where she was a woman who moved from one man's protection to the next, never independent, always kept, always defined by whatever arrangement she was currently in. And that version was a lie. She knew it was a lie. The whole truth of her was the refutation of it, and yet it had landed somewhere deep and old and painful in the same way that the right blade always finds the existing wound. She packed the blue dress. She packed the gray dress. She packed her books, 3 of them wrapped in the spare shawl. She was reaching for the 4th book when she heard it, a small, careful sound in the hallway. She had thought Eli was at the table doing his lessons. She was wrong. She stood at the window with her back to the doorway, looking out at the March desert, the ironwood blossoms just beginning, the land going gold and red in the afternoon light, her hands pressed flat against the window frame, and her heart doing something very complicated in her chest. Behind her, without a sound, Eli Townsend came into the room. He was 11 years old and not small for his age, and his dark hair curled at his ears and his eyes were the color of deep creek water, and he moved with the deliberate care of someone performing an act of great importance. He went to the leather bag. He unfastened the buckle. He reached inside with both hands and lifted out the gray dress, carefully, the way he had watched Grace fold things 100 times, and he refolded it and set it on the bed. He took out the blue dress and smoothed it and set it beside the gray. He took out the books and placed them on the bedside table, spine up, the way Grace always kept them. He worked steadily and silently, his young face holding the gravity of someone who knows what is at stake, until the bag was empty. Then he sat down on the floor beside it, wrapped both arms around his knees, and waited. Grace turned around. She found him there on the floor beside the empty bag, looking up at her with those creekwater eyes, and on his face was the complete, undisguised love of a child who has decided, without reservation or condition, that a person is his. She stood very still. Then Eli said quietly, "Please don't go, Miss Grace." He had called her Miss Grace since the day she arrived, and she had never asked him to change it, and he had never changed it on his own. And hearing it now, in this moment, with the empty bag between them and her 7 months rounded belly and the March light coming through the window, it was the most tender thing she had ever heard in her life. Grace Easton sat down on the floor of the bedroom of the Townsend Ranch in the Arizona Territory, in March of 1888, 7 months pregnant and fully undone, and she pulled the 11-year-old boy who had quietly unpacked her bag into her arms, and she held him, and she cried for a while, which she had not done in a long time, the full and uncomplicated kind of crying that means something has finally been allowed through. Eli held on with both arms. He said, his voice slightly muffled against her shoulder, "Papa would be very sad if you went," she said. "Would he?" He said, "Yes, he would not say so. He would be quiet and work very hard, but he would be very sad." She said, "What about you?" He pulled back and looked at her with great seriousness. He said, "I would be devastated." 12-year-old seriousness, 11-year-old precision. She loved him enormously. She said, "Eli." He said, "Yes." She said, "Your uncle said terrible things." He said, "I know, I heard." She said, "None of them were true." He said, with the specific certainty of a child who has done his own accounting, "I know they weren't." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I have been watching you since March of 1884, and I know exactly who you are, Miss Grace." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Did your father teach you to say that?" He said with dignity, "He says things like it sometimes, but that one was mine." She laughed, the full, unguarded kind. She left the bag on the floor empty, and she went out to the kitchen and she sat down at the table and she waited. Jonas came in from the East Range at dusk. He came through the kitchen door, and he stopped when he saw Grace at the table, and he read her face with the precision that he had developed over 3 years of knowing her, and some of the tension left his shoulders. He sat down across from her. He said, "Eli told me," she said, "that I packed the bag." He said, "that he unpacked it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "He is a remarkable child." Jonas said quietly, "He is. He has the advantage of a remarkable teacher." They sat in the kitchen in the March evening light for a while without speaking, and it was one of the good silences, the kind that is full rather than empty, the kind that means two people have been through something together and come through it still facing the same direction. Then Grace said, "I am not going to let my uncle's story of me become the one I believe about myself." Jonas said, "No, you are not." She said, "I am the woman who came to Arizona Territory with a leather bag and a letter of employment and no particular expectations, and I built a life here with my own hands and my own decisions and my own choices, and this is where I am and this is who I am." Jonas said, "Yes," she said, "and I am staying." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she felt his thumb trace across her knuckles in the particular slow way he had. And the kitchen was warm and the light was going amber, and outside the ironwood blossoms were opening in the March desert. She was staying. James Townsend arrived in May of 1888, precisely when Grace had calculated he would, on a Tuesday morning when the desert was already warm at 7 o'clock, and the distant mountains had that clean, sharp edge that comes after a night rain. He arrived with considerable enthusiasm and a set of lungs that impressed everyone present, including Dr. Merritt from Redemption, who attended the birth, and Carmen Reyes, who had been staying at the ranch for the final 2 weeks of Grace's pregnancy, and who held Grace's hand with a grip that Grace suspected would leave marks. Jonas was present throughout, which was not the universal custom, but which Grace had required of him in very clear terms and which he had agreed to without argument, and which, when it came to it, was simply right in the way that things are right when they fit the exact shape of the situation they belong to. Eli had been sent to wait in the kitchen with Pedro Reyes. When James was born, and the immediate business of his arrival was attended to, and he had been cleaned and wrapped and placed in Grace's arms with his red, furious, already opinionated face turned up to the light, Jonas sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and his wife, and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "He looks angry." Grace said, "He is. He had very comfortable accommodations until approximately 20 minutes ago." Jonas said, "He has your eyes." She looked down at the baby. She said, "Those are most definitely your eyes, Jonas Townsend." He said, "They're gray." She said, "Yours are gray." He said, "I thought they were green." She said, "They are not green." Eli appeared in the doorway at this point, having clearly decided that the time allotted for waiting in the kitchen had been more than sufficient, and he stood looking at the baby in Grace's arms with an expression of concentrated evaluation, and then he said, "He is very small." Grace said, "He will grow." Eli said, "He has Papa's ears." Grace said, "Yes." Eli said with great satisfaction, "James is a good name," as though he had been consulted and had approved it, which he had been and he had. Jonas looked at his son and his wife and his older son in the doorway, and the kitchen light was coming in golden from the hall, and the Arizona morning was pressing warm against the windows. And Grace looked up from the baby and found Jonas looking at her with an expression she knew by now as completely as she knew the lines of the ranch land, as well as she knew the sound of his voice in the dark, and the particular quality of his stillness when he was moved beyond easy words. She said quietly, "We are all right, Jonas." He said, "Yes." She said, "We are better than all right." He said, with the fullness of everything he had not said through the years and everything he had and everything they had been to each other, "Yes, we are." The months that followed James's birth had the particular quality of a life that has found its right form. The baby was healthy and loud, and opinionated in ways that delighted his father and amused his brother. And Grace recovered her energy by July, and was back at the lending library by August, bringing James with her in the wicker basket that Carmen Reyes had made for the purpose. And the people of Redemption received the sight of Grace Townsend with her infant son among the bookshelves with the warmth that a town extends to its own, when it recognizes that one of its members has built something lasting. Eli continued his lessons through the summer of 1888 and into the autumn, and by the following spring, he had completed the full curriculum that Grace had designed for him and had outrun it considerably. And Grace wrote to the territorial superintendent of education in Phoenix about the possibility of Eli attending the new high school that had recently been established in Tucson. The reply was encouraging, and Jonas and Grace spent 2 evenings talking it through, all the angles, the distance, the cost, what it would mean for Eli and what it would mean for all of them. They told Eli in April of 1889, and his reaction was the measured, serious, deeply pleased response of a boy who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity and who was trying not to show how much he had been waiting for it. He said he would need to take his books. Grace said obviously. He said he would write every week. Jonas said he expected nothing less. Eli said, with the particular Eli gravity that had been his signature from the age of 7, "I will miss James." James, who was 11 months old and sitting on the kitchen floor attempting to eat a wooden spoon, gave this the consideration it deserved, and then returned to the spoon. Samuel Easton wrote once more, in the summer of 1888. The letter was briefer and less angry than his visit had been. He wrote that he was in Albuquerque, that things were difficult, that he did not expect Grace to feel any obligation toward him, but that he wanted her to know he regretted some of what he had said. He did not specify which parts, but Grace read the letter twice and concluded that the regret was genuine enough, if incomplete, and that it deserved a measured response. She wrote back. She told him she bore him no ill will. She did not offer money, because she did not believe money was what the situation required, and because she had learned at some cost that giving money to people who have demonstrated a particular relationship with it tends to solve nothing. She told him that she was well and that she had a son, and that she was glad to hear from him. She told him that if he ever passed through Arizona territory, he was welcome to call on them. He never did, but the letter had been the right thing to write, and she knew it. Edmund Hayes wrote in January of 1889 to confirm that the Memphis property matter was fully and finally resolved, that all claims had been settled, and that he was closing the matter in his files. Grace folded his letter and put it in the small tin box she kept in the drawer of the bedside table with the other letters of record, and she closed the drawer, and that was that. The winter of 1889 was a good one. James learned to walk in November, lurching across the kitchen floor with a concentrated determination that his father found absolutely gripping. And Eli was at the table working on an essay about the political history of the Arizona Territory, which had been organized as a formal territory in 1863 and was not yet a state, a fact that Grace and Eli had discussed at length as part of his studies in civic history. The fire was going in the small iron stove in the corner, and the smell of pine wood smoke mixed with the supper Grace had made, and the winter night was very still outside. Jonas came in from checking the horses and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the three of them, Eli with his essay and his lantern, James pulling himself upright against the kitchen chair with the specific fury of a 1-year-old who has not yet achieved reliable walking, Grace at the stove stirring something that smelled of onion and beef. He said, "It is cold out." Eli said, "Yes, I expect it is." Grace said, without turning around, "There is coffee." James said something that was not a word, but carried the full confidence of someone who intended to start using words very soon and expected them to be effective when he did. Jonas crossed the kitchen and stood behind Grace at the stove and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back into him for a moment, just a moment, the brief, ordinary intimacy of a couple in their kitchen on a winter evening, and he said quietly near her ear, "Are you happy?" She turned slightly to look up at him. She said, "Jonas." He said, "Are you?" She said, "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life, and if you need me to say that more often, I will say it every day." He said, "I don't need it every day." She said, "How often?" He said, "Whenever it's true." She said, "It has been true consistently since approximately April of 1885, with occasional interruptions during drought years and visits from difficult relatives." He said, with that rare, complete smile that she had been watching build in him since the evening she had arrived in Redemption, and he had tipped his hat and said almost nothing, "I can work with those terms." She said, "I know you can." Eli from the table said, "Are you two going to talk about history, or are you going to be like this all evening?" Grace said, "Finish your essay, Eli." Eli said, "Yes, Miss Grace," with precisely the tone that meant he was satisfied with everything and was simply maintaining the ritual at this point. The leather bag was in the wardrobe in the bedroom. Grace had not touched it since March of 1888. It sat there with the marks of its 3 packings on the worn leather sides, a kind of record of the time she had almost chosen differently, almost let the fear win, almost retreated back into the self she had been before Redemption, Arizona, and the roan mare on the ridge and the quiet man with the creek-water-eyed son. The bag did not frighten her anymore. It was simply a bag. What it represented now was not the possibility of flight, but the evidence of staying. Of the 3 times she had come to the edge, and the 3 times something had brought her back, and the last time it had been the specific and total love of an 11-year-old boy sitting on the floor with his arms around his knees saying, "Please don't go," and she had not gone, and she was here, and here was the right place to be. In the spring of 1890, Eli left for Tucson on the stage on a Tuesday morning. With his books in a canvas bag Jonas had bought in Redemption for the purpose, and 2 letters of introduction that Grace had written to 2 separate educators in the city who had replied to her correspondence with warmth and interest. He stood on the stage platform in redemption with his father and Grace and James, who was 22 months old and not entirely clear on the significance of the occasion, but aware that it warranted his best attention. Eli shook his father's hand and then submitted to being hugged by Grace without the theatrical protest that might have been expected of a 12-year-old, because Eli had never pretended to be other than what he was, and what he was included a deep and uncomplicated affection for the woman who had been teaching him since he was 7. He looked at James. He said, "You will walk him every evening." Grace said, "James walks himself now, Eli." Eli said, "I mean a proper walk." "Not just around the kitchen," Jonas said. "He will have proper walks." Eli said with great dignity, "Good." He got on the stage. He waved from the window. James waved back with both arms, not quite sure where to direct the wave but committed to the gesture. Jonas watched the stage until it was dust on the road toward the junction, and Grace stood beside him and took his hand. He said after a while, "I expect he will be fine." She said, "He will be more than fine. He will be extraordinary." Jonas said, "He gets that from you." She said, "He gets it from both of us." He looked at her. He said, "Yes." They drove back to the ranch in the morning light, James between them on the buckboard seat, and the ironwood blossoms were out in full force, and the desert was impossibly alive with the brief, extravagant generosity of an Arizona spring. And Grace looked at the land that had been hers for 6 years now and felt the full depth of her belonging to it. By 1891 she was expecting again. This was a Sunday morning announcement made at the kitchen table over coffee, and Jonas received it with a stillness that she recognized as joy being absorbed rather than contained. And James, who was 3 years old and possessed of a firm and entirely confident vocabulary, said, "Baby," with the recognition of a child who has heard this word used in relevant contexts before and finds it interesting. Jonas said, "Yes, a baby." James said, "Mine." Grace said, "Ours." James considered this. He said, "Good." The baby arrived in September of 1891, a girl this time, which Grace had suspected from the particular way she had been carrying through the summer. They named her Clara, after no one specific but because it was a clear name that stood on its own, and she arrived in September on a cool morning with a quality of autumn light that made everything in the bedroom look lit from behind. And she was small and dark-haired and immediately authoritative in the way of certain babies who arrive already certain of their own importance. Eli came home for Christmas that year, having finished his first term in Tucson with academic results that his schoolmaster described in a letter to Jonas and Grace as exceptional, and his manner as a credit to his upbringing. He was 13 now, taller than Grace had expected, and he held Clara with the careful attention of someone who has been thinking about this meeting for months. And Clara, who was 3 months old and not particularly interested in visitors, submitted to being held by him with reasonable tolerance, which Jonas said was high praise from Clara. Grace watched her family at the Christmas table and understood that this was what she had been building since the day she had stepped off the stage in redemption with her leather bag and her careful intentions and her deeply armored heart. This table, these people, this life that she had been stubborn enough and frightened enough and brave enough to stay for. Jonas caught her looking at him across the table and raised his coffee cup slightly. She raised hers. James banged his cup on the table in what he apparently felt was the spirit of the occasion. Clara slept in the wicker basket beside the stove with the comprehensive indifference of a 3-month-old to celebrations not centered on her. Eli said, "I would like to make a toast." Everyone looked at him. He was 13 and entirely serious. He said, "To Miss Grace, who came here when we needed her and stayed when we needed her more, and who built the library, and who taught me everything worth knowing, and who is the best person in the Arizona territory and probably in the whole country." There was a brief silence. Jonas said, quietly, "Agreed." Grace said, "Eli Townsend, you are going to make someone extremely happy someday when you put that particular eloquence towards something personal." Eli went slightly pink and said, "I am 13, she said. "You have time." He said with dignity, "Yes, I know." James said, "Library." Everyone looked at James. He said, "I like the library," with great seriousness, and the table erupted, and Clara woke up and was briefly annoyed and then subsided back into sleep. And the Christmas evening on the Townsend Ranch in the Arizona Territory in 1891 went on in the way that good evenings go on, full and warm and in no hurry to be over. The lending library grew. By 1893, it had expanded to 2 rooms and held over 300 volumes, and Grace had established a program of weekly reading evenings that drew people from both the town and the surrounding ranches with a consistency that confirmed her original instinct, that people will come to knowledge if you make it available and welcoming and free of judgment. Jonas helped her build the shelves for the second room one Saturday in October with Pedro Reyes assisting, and James underfoot offering opinions about which plank went where. And Clara, 2 years old and already self-possessed in a way that made Grace think of herself at that age, sat on the library floor with a picture book open in her lap, and turned the pages with the serene authority of a child who has been around books since before she could talk. Jonas set the last shelf in place and stepped back to look at it, and Grace stood beside him and looked at the 2 rooms full of books in the building on the main street of Redemption, Arizona, and she thought about the woman who had arrived here in 1884 with $70 experience of the world and a leather bag, and the conviction that she would never trust anything she had not first thoroughly examined. She thought about what trust had cost her and what it had given her. She took Jonas's hand. He said without looking away from the shelves, "You should be proud." She said, "I am," he said, "of yourself." She said, "Of what we have built, all of it." He looked at her then and she looked at him, and they were 35 and 41, and they had been through the droughts and the letters from Memphis and the difficult relatives, and the 3 packings of the leather bag and the long evenings of honest, careful truth-telling, and the 2 children sleeping in their house, and the 3rd who was in Tucson making something remarkable of himself, and the library and the ranch and the land that was theirs and the life that was absolutely, unequivocally, fully and permanently theirs. Jonas said, "I am glad you stayed." She said, "I am glad I stayed." He said, "The first time and the second time and the 3rd time." She said, "Especially the 3rd time." He said, "What changed your mind the 3rd time?" She said, "Your son sat on the floor beside an empty bag and looked at me and asked me please not to go." Jonas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He is a good boy." She said, "He is an extraordinary person. He always has been." Jonas said with the gravity that meant it was important, "He is what he is partly because of you, Grace. You should know that." She said, "We made him together." He said, "Yes, we did." The late afternoon October light came through the library windows and lay warm and flat across the new wooden shelves. And outside on the main street of Redemption, Arizona, the town went about its business in the ordinary, vivid way of places that are alive. And Grace Easton Townsend stood with her husband's hand in hers in the 2-room lending library that had begun as a single room and a leather bag's worth of settlement money. And she was, without qualification, reservation, or the smallest shadow of doubt, exactly where she was meant to be. The leather bag remained in the wardrobe in the bedroom for many years after. Occasionally, Grace took it down to use for a trip to Tucson, or when Eli came home from his studies and needed it borrowed, or when the family traveled the following year to Memphis, of all places, for the brief and unexpectedly healing visit to the city of Grace's childhood that she and Jonas made in the spring of 1894, bringing James, now 6, and Clara, now 2.5, and staying at a hotel on a street Grace remembered from her girlhood. She stood on that street and looked at the city and found that it was simply a city, a place where things had happened, not the source of her story but one early chapter of it, before she had understood that the story was hers to write. She did not pack the bag to go back to Arizona. She packed it to come home. That was the difference. Eli graduated from the high school in Tucson in 1894 at 17, which was young, and which his schoolmaster managed to make sound both exceptional and entirely expected of him. He came back to Redemption for the summer before deciding what came next, and he spent those months working the ranch with his father and reading in the library and teaching James his early lessons with a patience and enjoyment that made Grace think, not for the first time, that he had a talent for it. He was taller than Jonas by then, which Jonas noticed without commenting on, and he had his father's quiet and his mother Catherine's brightness, some combination of his origins and his upbringing that had produced something that was entirely its own. He sat at the kitchen table the night before he left for Phoenix, where he had secured a position as a junior clerk at a law firm through a contact of Edmund Hayes, and he said to Grace, with the directness he had always had, "I want you to know that you are the reason I want to do something worthwhile with my life." Grace said, "Eli," he said, "I mean it." She said, "You are the reason you want to do something worthwhile with your life." "That was always in you," he said. "You saw it when I was 7 years old and you made it real." She looked at this young man who had been a small, watchful child on a porch step when she first met him, and she felt the particular fullness that she had come to understand as the mark of something that has grown into its right form. She said, "You will write," he said, "every week, as I always have." He did. The Townsend Ranch expanded in 1895 when Jonas acquired an additional 300 acres to the south, bringing the total to nearly 1,500, and Grace managed the household accounts for the expanded operation with the precision she brought to everything, and the ranch was in the best shape it had ever been. Pedro Reyes retired in 1896, having worked the land for over 20 years, and Jonas and Grace marked the occasion with a supper that drew half of Redemption, because Pedro was beloved in the community in the way that good, steady men become beloved over the decades of their reliability. Will and Thomas Cord, the brothers who had cleaned up considerably for Jonas and Grace's wedding in 1885, had both since married women from Redemption and had children who knew James and Clara, and the web of connection that is what a community actually is, under the surface of its commerce and its politics, had grown rich and strong and real over the years of Grace's presence in it. She turned 38 in the autumn of 1895, and Jonas made the occasion with a kind of attention to detail that she had learned to expect from him for the things that mattered to him, which was a different category from the things that mattered generally. He gave her a book she had been trying to find for 2 years, tracked down through a bookseller in San Francisco that Edmund Hayes had a connection to, and he gave her a letter that he had written himself, 3 pages in his careful, deliberate handwriting, telling her what the years had been and what she was to him, and which Grace kept in the tin box in the bedside drawer with the letters of record, because it was a letter of record too, the most important kind. James started his formal schooling in 1895 with a teacher newly arrived in Redemption, a young woman named Miss Alvarez who came from the growing Mexican-American community in the territory, and who was exactly the kind of teacher that Grace had hoped would eventually come to Redemption, trained and rigorous and warmly attentive. James was 7 and restless and tremendously interested in the cattle operation in a way that reminded Jonas of himself at that age, and he approached schoolwork with the tolerant commitment of someone who understands its necessity without being particularly enchanted by it, except for geography and arithmetic, which he devoured. Clara, at 4, was already showing signs of the particular intellectual ferocity that Grace recognized from her own girlhood, and Grace began her earliest lessons the way she had always begun, with stories first and everything else following naturally from the child's own questions. Clara's questions were exhausting and wonderful, and came at a rate and from directions that kept Grace genuinely on her toes, and Jonas found this state of affairs satisfying in a quiet, private way that he expressed mainly by making sure the Denver catalog was always within Grace's reach. In 1897, Eli married. Her name was Josephine Morales, and she was 22 years old and the daughter of a respected family in Tucson, and she had met Eli at the law firm where he had risen from junior clerk to assistant attorney in 3 years. Sharp and tenacious in the courtroom, in exactly the way that Grace had always predicted. Josephine was a woman of her own particular strength and clarity, and when Grace met her for the first time at the wedding in Tucson, which the whole Townsend family attended, she recognized in her something that felt like kinship, the quality of a woman who has decided, fully and without apology, who she is. The wedding was in September, and Grace sat in the church in Tucson with Jonas on one side and Clara on the other, and James fidgeting between Jonas and Pedro Reyes, who had come up from redemption for the occasion. And she watched Eli at 20 years old stand in front of the priest with Josephine on his arm and make promises that she knew, in the way she had come to know things about Eli, he would keep. Jonas put his arm around her shoulders, very gently, and she leaned into him for a moment. She thought about a boy sitting on a floor with his arms around his knees. She thought about an empty leather bag. She thought about the March morning when she had stood at the window looking out at the desert, and behind her a child had quietly, deliberately, with all the love in his small heart, unpacked everything she had been trying to take away. She thought about how much had grown from that single act of love, from one child refusing to let the person he loved walk out of his life, from the way that refusal had cracked open something that Grace had needed to have cracked open, from the way it had led to the full truth finally being spoken, and the full life finally being claimed. She thought about the bag in the wardrobe and how it sat there now, simply a bag, its old meaning gone, replaced by the accumulated reality of everything that had been chosen and built and given and received in the years since that March afternoon. Jonas said quietly near her ear, "What are you thinking about?" she said. "A boy on a floor." He said, "Eli," she said. "He was 11 years old and he unpacked my bag without a word and he sat down and waited for me to see what he had done." Jonas said after a moment, "I know," she said. "Did you tell him to do that?" He said, "No," she said. "He did it himself." He said, "Yes," she said. "He saved everything. You understand that?" Jonas said, "He knew what to do when I didn't." She looked at him. She said, "You knew what to do. You have always known what to do. You have just occasionally needed reminding." He said with that rare complete smile, "That is true." At the front of the church, Eli was saying the words that bound him to Josephine, and his voice was steady and clear, and carried the kind of certainty that is not the absence of fear but the decision to move through it. And Grace thought that this too was something he had learned, if not from her directly then from watching two people learn it together over the years, and there was no gift she could have given him that she was more glad of. She was glad she had stayed. She had always been glad. She was the woman who had packed her bag 3 times, and every time she had stayed, and the staying had built something that packed bags and fears and hidden pasts and dark motives and secret wounds could never have built, because those things are the enemies of the slow and necessary and beautiful work of choosing someone fully and being chosen fully in return. The Townsend ranch sat in the late September Tucson light outside the church windows. No, not the ranch. The whole territory. The whole enormous, gorgeous, complicated, difficult, impossible territory of the American West in 1897, with all its injustices and beauties and open sky. And Grace Easton Townsend sat in a church pew with her husband's arm around her shoulders and her family around her. And she was, without qualification, home. In the years that followed, Eli built a distinguished career in Tucson law, eventually arguing cases before the territorial court that addressed land rights and the legal standing of Mexican-American and indigenous families in the territory, work that was not always safe and was always necessary, and that Grace followed with an intense and entirely unsurprised pride. Josephine had 2 children, a son named Thomas born in 1899 and a daughter named Elena born in 1901. And they came to the Townsend ranch for Christmas and for summer weeks, and the house was full in the way that houses are full when multiple generations have chosen to remain in each other's lives. James, at 15, had decided definitively that the cattle operation was his vocation, and he began working full days alongside Jonas and the newer ranch hands with an energy and a gift for the practical business of ranching that Jonas observed with a quiet satisfaction. He expressed mainly by teaching James everything he knew, methodically, the way he did most things, and by trusting him with increasing responsibility in the way that builds rather than overwhelms. James was a different kind of person than Eli, more physical, less bookish, and more connected to the land in a direct, sensory way. And Grace loved him with the same completeness she loved Eli, which is the particular achievement of parents who understand that love does not require sameness. Clara, at 10 in 1901, had surpassed every expectation of the lending library's catalog, and had begun writing letters to Grace's contact at the educational organization in Phoenix about the possibility of attending the territorial normal school when she was old enough to train as a teacher. Grace assisted with these letters, of course, and read them with the pride of someone who recognizes a direct line of inheritance, even when the inherited thing is not a physical resemblance, but something more essential. Jonas turned 50 in 1902, and Grace marked the occasion with the same kind of careful, deliberate attention that he had always brought to the things that mattered. A dinner with everyone who mattered at the ranch table, which required 2 tables pushed together and every chair in the house plus 3 borrowed from the Ray's family, and a letter she had written, 3 pages in her careful handwriting, telling him what the years had been and what he was to her. He read it at the table after the dinner, with the family around him, and he folded it very precisely when he finished and held it in both hands for a moment and said nothing. And Grace watched him from across the crowded table and understood that the silence was the fullest possible response. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet and the Arizona dark was pressing soft against the windows, Jonas said to her, "You said in the letter that coming to redemption was the best decision you ever made." She said, "Yes." He said, "Was it a decision, or was it necessity?" She thought about the question. She said, "It was necessity that became a decision. I needed to go somewhere and I came here. And then coming here became a choice I made every day, and the choosing became the best thing about it." He said, "The choosing." She said, "Every single day, Jonas. Every single day I have chosen this, and I have been grateful for the choosing." He said, "So have I." She said, "I know." He said, "The bag, does it still mean something? The leather bag." She looked at him in the dark. She said, "It means that I came here with very little and I built everything. And that sometimes you have to come close to the edge to know how much you want the ground you're standing on." He said, "You are not going to tell me you regret packing it." She said, "No. I am going to tell you I am glad Eli unpacked it." He said, "So am I." She said, "He knew what we were before we did." Jonas said, "He was always a perceptive child." She said, "He gets that from his father." He said, "He gets it from his teacher." She said, "Then we made him between us." He said, "Yes, we made everything between us." The last thing Grace Easton Townsend ever packed that leather bag for was a trip to Phoenix in the autumn of 1905, when Eli argued his most important case before the territorial court, a land rights case on behalf of a Tohono O'odham family that had been dispossessed of property they had held for generations. The case drew attention from newspapers as far as Denver, and Eli argued it with the precise and driven eloquence of a man who has been building toward this kind of work his entire career. Grace sat in the gallery of the territorial courthouse in Phoenix with Jonas beside her and Clara beside him. Clara, now 14 and entirely clear about what she was watching and why it mattered, and she listened to her stepson, her first child in every way that counted, make the case for justice with a skill and a passion and a groundedness that moved her past ordinary pride into something that felt like completion. The court ruled in the family's favor. Eli walked out of the courthouse and found his family on the steps, and he looked at Grace the way he had looked at her from the floor of the bedroom with his arms around his knees, with that complete and uncomplicated love, and he said, "Thank you," she said. "For what specifically?" He said, "For staying." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You are the one who made sure of that." He said, "We both had a part." She said, "Yes, we did." Jonas took her hand on the courthouse steps, and the Phoenix sky was an enormous, cloudless October blue, and the Arizona territory was alive all around them, complicated and beautiful and unjust and worth fighting for. And Grace Easton Townsend stood in the middle of it with her family and her history and her choices fully behind her. All the packed bags and unpacked bags, and the 3 times she had come to the edge and been held back. And she was 50 years old and fierce and whole and loved and grateful. The leather bag was in the wardrobe back in Redemption. It was staying there. They all were.